But I wanted to just absolutely make crystal clear some things about the syllabus and the way Canvas works. So the way I've got things set up is I've posted some discussions. As soon as you participate in the discussion, then I can give you credit for it. Then you've got that 200 points. So all you had to do for one of the discussions is just introduce yourself. And I gave you credit for that. But the other discussions, I want you to reply 3 times for that in order to get credit. So you're sort of engaging with the other students on a particular topic. Now, you can choose discussions. So I have a really long discussion that I had by email with a student this morning on the intricacies, sort of the more esoteric debates about the kinds of statements that we have there. And so I thought, well, I'll just post the whole thing. And then if you want to engage in that discussion, you can do that. Or I also just posted another discussion topic. And remember, you have to do 2 per week, and they are timed so that you can't at the end of the semester go back and participate in a bunch of discussions. You have to participate during the time we're actually talking about the substance of those classes. So the discussions will be presented to you in your Canvas, where you can look it up on your Canvas calendar, I guess is where I've posted these things too. So it should come to you as a notification, hey, there's another discussion going on. Then you get, then you can get your credit for the 2 discussions when you do that. There's a few other announcements. Okay, wait. Oh, here's the chat. Okay, now I've got that better. So assignments will be available also their time. So the critical thinking assignments, those are all uploaded into Canvas, and you can participate in them as you will, but then they'll close. So, after the part of the class, there's 4 parts. After the part of the class that they're in, they will close. And so, or actually after the week that they'll close, because then we'll discuss the critical thinking challenge in class. And so you can't go back and do it after we've discussed it. The other thing to pay attention to is if you want credit for group work, you've got to do it every week. You've got to just upload or just type into Canvas in that group work assignment thing. What we did in our group this week is this, and just I don't care about grammar. I don't care about clarity. Just say what you did in your group. And then that, and so group work will close, I think it's Sunday night at midnight, this coming Sunday. So you have this whole week to, upload a sentence or 2 about meeting with your group outside of class and what you studied and what you talked about and that stuff. Reading and lecture quizzes are due Monday at 11 a.m. before class, and then they close. And so you won't get credit for it if you try to participate in it after it's closed. So I just want to make sure that you pay attention for when the reading quiz is available, and it's over the reading and the lecture. So the quiz that's due Sunday night is going to be over class for the week and over the readings for the week, and then some of the readings for the coming week. Okay, the other thing is that I guess we're technically having class on Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and I don't think that's fair or nice, since a lot of you might be traveling or busy or with family, and so I've canceled that class. And just to pay attention to, in the course outline of the syllabus, in fact, maybe I'll share that just so that you can see. Right now I'm busy uploading it. It still hasn't uploaded because it's 100 megs. So let me go to this one. So in the course outline, this is where all the, you can download the PowerPoint lecture, you can look at the logical fallacy videos, and then download the readings from the course outline, and then I put all the grading and all the assignment description at the end of the syllabus, just so that you could see that. So, and in the course outline, so I'm trying to create a Zoom link or a link to our Zoom class and a link to the PowerPoint slides. And if I forget to do that or whatever, just send me an email and let me know that. So I just wanted to make that announcement, just so you know that it's sort of up to you to get those things in on time, because then that'll close and then the assignment will disappear for all practical purposes. I thought maybe I'd stop for a second just to see if there's any questions. Let me see the chat.
I have a question.
Okay, please go ahead.
So I think you might have answered it, but just to clarify with the discussions, they're going to be due by the end of the week. So like Friday.
The discussions aren't due until Sunday night.
Okay.
Yeah, the discussions are due Sunday night. So you have, I try to give a little bit of leeway so that you know, some people work on the weekends, other people work during the week. Just try to get, you know, be respectful of the fact that you have other lives outside of this class. But then I also want you to be engaging with the material around the same time that we're engaging with the material. So the discussions close midnight Sunday night.
Okay. And then, sorry, just one more thing for the, I'm sorry, I forgot my question. It'll come back to me.
Okay, definitely come back. Seth, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, so I had a question about the group works.
Okay.
Where exactly do you want us to submit the like overview of what we did for the week?
So the way I think that it appears to you is in two different places. If you look in your assignments section in Canvas, it should appear to you. The group work week 1 should appear, and then you just click on that and you write a sentence inside Canvas, and then it automatically goes to me to be graded. And, you know, we're sort of on the honor code here, but if you say, oh, we, you know, talked about XYZ, and all the other group members say, we didn't talk about XYZ, we talked about something else, then I'll kind of get clued into, you know, fudging that, you know, but I basically am trying to allow you to just be on your honor code. But do you see that in your Canvas where there's like a place to submit group work?
Yeah, I see it. So
okay,
how long do you want it to be?
a sentence. And Nadia, I don't even care if it's a complete sentence. Just put in a few phrases that say, we talked about, you know, these 3 things, and that's it. That, you know, it's not meant to be a long drawn out thing. Unless you want my feedback and say, one thing we talked about was this, what do you think about that? And then I can reply and all of that. But I'm just really looking for you to say that you did something, you know. And I don't take off for grammar anyway, for anything, even I correct it, but I don't take off for it. But don't worry about, especially in discussions and your group work summaries and that kind of stuff, don't worry too much about grammar. I mean, even for your critical thinking challenges, I don't really care so much about grammar as much as the substance of what you're thinking about. So the point is not to be perfect in those things. The papers, you know, if you've decided to write a paper, then I'm going to go back and forth with you on drafts, and then I kind of expect you to respond to the comments, because I will correct grammar. But I figure if you show up in my class and you don't know a grammatical rule, that's your former teacher's fault, which you should not be paying for that fault, you know, problem in my class. So I like to assess only what I've taught, you know, so that's kind of my teaching philosophy there. Does anybody else have any questions? Nicholas, did your idea come back to you?
No, I forgot, but I might have to email you later. Thanks, though.
That's fine. That's fine. And you know, if you remember, please feel free to raise your hand here. Okay, so let's go to the PowerPoint slide. So, you know, let me give you a little bit of history into why I am so stringent about understanding the difference between the different kinds of statements that you could make. And that is that years ago, when I was just a beginning assistant professor, I would assign papers and I would have infinite rewrites. And I would say, okay, so tell me what the law is. Tell me what the cases say the law is. Do not tell me what your reaction to it is. You don't think it's fair. You don't think it's right. You think some other standard should be right. And I would say that, and half the students would do it anyway. And I would be like, no, you're supposed to be interpreting the law, not telling me what your opinion is about the law. But it is your opinion about the interpretation. And so I found that so difficult. And people would just get zeros and then they fail the class. And I'd be like, well, you know, at some point it's my failure, you know. And so I started doing a quiz and exercises associated with having people really think thoughtfully about what is the implication of what I'm saying. And one of the students engaged particularly thoughtfully on that. So I you know, when you are thoughtful, then I pay you back with my thoughtfulness. So I spent all morning responding to the email, kind of talking about the esoterics of this and that. And it's my sense that most professors expect that you know this information, but no one's ever taught it to you. When did you learn it? You didn't learn it in high school. That, you know, what you learn in high school, I think, is facts are different from opinions. And in a sense, in high school, and maybe I'm wrong about this in today's high school world, but you know, we learn that facts are better than opinions, you know, and that's the exact opposite of the case. In college, what you're learning to do is make informed judgments that are informed by the evidence. And there's different kinds of evidence that's required by different kinds of arguments. And you're required to learn to make good causal inferences that are based on the data, that you can be critical of the data or critical of the generalizations or critical of the causal inferences, and make informed judgments about should we eat meat, or is such and such, does it constitute cruel and unusual or punishment, or is this search that the police just did, is that illegal? And some legal questions and normative questions and causal questions are more we're more sure of those. Does smoking cause cancer? Yes. Right, like the answer. You know, the idea is to kind of figure out how informed it is. So when I teach my statistics class, I talk to the students about a concept called falsifiability, which if you read the PowerPoint slides, you saw my discussion about that. That your goal is to take on a question, and I mean your goal in your entire college career, that is falsifiable, right? It can be wrong. And the more it can be wrong, the better in terms of your grade and in terms of the usefulness or the quality of an essay. The more wrong it can be, the better. Now that, I don't know what your reaction to that is. Is that you knew that already, or it sounds bizarre to you? I figure it could be any of those reactions, but I don't know if anybody has a reaction to share about that. But it doesn't take a medical genius to show that smoking causes cancer. right? And so, but it does take a medical genius to figure out, does this vaccine help against COVID-19? That takes medical genius, right? That, like, then you have to really get into the inferences and the kind of data and the
Is she frozen for you guys?
Yeah.
Yep.
She keeps going in and out like the entire lecture.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
Completely frozen now.
Yeah.
I miss you, Professor.
She was just getting to the good part too.
Yeah. Well, that makes every single one of my classes this semester have tech problems.
Honestly, I think the semester is going to go great.
Bless the students that work at the tech department.
Mackenzie, I think you're our new professor right now because you're the host, right?
How
I don't.
long is the freshmen in the dorms?
It's like the only time we can talk during class.
Wait, does it say in the-
Mackenzie, can you make us all pastries?
No, I don't work in a bakery anymore. God, Paul. I'll bring them, don't worry. You know I will.
Mackenzie's worked at like some of like the best, like she's like a really good pastry chef, like really good.
Wait, is she the one who worked at like the best restaurants in the world or some shit?
I did, not in the country, and like only in a few states.
That's a sick ass.
That's sick.
That's so impressive.
This is kind of a flex, Mac. I don't know.
Definitely a flex. I haven't done anything cool like that my whole life, so.
Well, I mean, I'm older also, so like I went to school and then I like took a few years off and now I'm back, so different. Yeah.
She's
We have to
back.
catch up.
She back?
She even like.
It says that she's the host, but her mic's
oh,
off.
I'm muted. Okay, now. All right. Are the rest of you still here? Oh, you're all still here. All right. I have no idea what happened. Sorry about that. Okay, so I was getting to falsifiability. And so like the point is that the more verifiable your essay is that you're writing for any class, not mine necessarily, but any class, the more boring it is. The more an 8th grade, book report can summarize a book, right? Any virtually 8th grader or 4th grader could summarize, the contents of a book. And so it's not that interesting. And your goal should be to be interesting. And that's the goal of an academic who's trying to publish. You have to publish something that people didn't know before. And, I always tell my grad students, for instance, that when you're on a job talk, which is this 1.5-hour presentation you give to try to get an academic job, you have to give people the sense of, that your idea is, wow, I never thought of that, and I should have thought of that, right? That something that's obvious, but was never obvious to anybody before, is how you get an academic job. And so your goal in your college career, and so this is why I feel like this class would help for it, your college career, is to be interesting, is to say something that's not necessarily true, but has to be defended with the evidence. And the more controversial, and I don't mean polemical when I say controversial, I mean the more non-obvious it is, the more you're challenging conventional wisdom, or wow, everything, you've said so far doesn't make any sense, or, the more you have to kind of rely on the evidence you're using in your essay to actually make the case for whatever argument you're making, the better. And so my job is to teach you how to use different kinds of evidence for the different kinds of arguments, because I find these kind of fallacies are just virtually everywhere in even in academic writing, even really smart people get this stuff wrong because they haven't taken a step back to think, well, wait a minute, what are my assumptions here? So I'm trying to prepare you with more of that. So wait a minute, can you not see my PowerPoint slide anymore?
I don't think you're sharing your screen
Got
right
it,
now.
because it all disappeared. All right. So let's talk a little bit then, unless does anybody have any questions? You can unmute yourself and if you do. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the difference between opinions and facts. So it's my sense that usually when people use the word opinion, they mean normative opinion. They mean, you know, what you believe the world should be. So, you know, you should vote for Donald Trump or you should vote for Biden. Those are opinions, right? Or the GOP was a great convention or a terrible convention, or, you know, whatever your normative opinions are. There's a long list of them. But legal arguments are also opinions. It's, you know, unless it's a fact. If you're saying, well, Griswold established the right to privacy, that is a fact because it says directly in Griswold, there is a right to privacy, right? So like, that's less of an opinion and more of a summary of the truth about what Griswold is. Now, should there be a right to privacy is a completely different kind of argument, right? But the fact that it exists, and that the Supreme Court considers that we have the right to privacy, that is truth, right? But when you get into Griswold, is a great one because that, you know, that case is so rich with words that could be taken two ways, you know, where if you look at the opinion, it's like, well, is marriage necessary for the right to privacy? I think that's not that clear. Now, do I believe the right to privacy should be tied to marriage? No, that's my normative opinion, but that's separate from what is the underlying logic of Griswold. And then you have to make an argument about what the meaning of the words are. So when the Supreme Court takes the cruel and unusual punishment, for instance, they have defined cruel with various cases. So a case may come to them and they'll say, you know what, we believe such and such kind of treatment, that's cruel. That's beyond the, you know, our ability to withstand, you know, the cruelty of that punishment. For instance, somebody lost in civil asset forfeiture. He lost his, I don't know car words, but Land Rover, some Hummer, some expensive car, because they said that somebody accused him of using drugs, of dealing drugs with that car. Well, the government can steal your car even if they've shown you to be innocent of that crime. And in this case, they found that he was guilty for, I don't know, some minor, you know, selling a little bit of marijuana or having a little bit of marijuana possession or whatever. And the police said, well, you did it illegal, so we get your Hummer, right? And then they get to use that to generate funds for the police department. And so people will say, well, wait a minute, you know, and so the Supreme Court just declared that that was cruel, you know, to take the person's Land Rover away because it was an exorbitant fine or something like that. And so, you know, for instance, with the death penalty, the Supreme Court said, well, I'll tell you what, it sure is cruel, but it's not unusual. Therefore, it doesn't violate the cruel and unusual, right? So the most important word there for the Supreme Court was and, you know. And so you've got to look to see, you know, what the meaning of the words are. And so that's why I want to try to separate legal opinions that are based on text about what the law is versus normative opinions or versus facts or versus causal kinds of thinking, because we get And when I say we, I mean I and probably you and most people get pretty lazy with our language. And we'll say, well, you know, we should have the right to assault rifles because of the Second Amendment. And it's like, wait a minute, are you saying all laws are virtuous and good? You know, because that's the assumption, right? Well, since it says in the Second Amendment that therefore we should have that right, you can't use text to defend philosophical should type of argument. So let's get into the nitty gritty here about talking about the distinctions between these various kinds of statements. So the three kinds of statements, interpretation, normative, and causal, those are all three opinions. And if they're not opinions, they're facts. So smoking causes cancer is getting more toward fact because, you know, it's just been shown over and over again that probabilistically you're more likely to get lung cancer, way more likely to get lung cancer if you smoke. So those are all three opinions. And facts are verifiable. And so when you take the quiz, what you want to sort of think about are when you're trying to decide, well, is this a fact or is this some kind of causal opinion or whatever, is how verifiable is it? For instance, in the esoteric discussion that I had with a student this morning, what was his question where he said, well, what if I say, I don't like guns? Isn't it a fact that I say I don't like guns, right? And so it's like, it's true, but like, think about this. When you're really thinking about, well, what is the intention of the speaker? And the example that I brought up is that some people, when they hear Trump say, I'm worried about mail-in ballots and fraud in the election, some people interpret what he says is that he cares about fraud and corruption. Other people look at that and they say he's trying to, you know, diminish the legitimacy of a democratic election that's coming up, sowing the seeds for, you know, him to say, look, I'm going to declare all mail-in ballots null and void, or get the post office not to deliver them or whatever, right? So we read into the intention of the speaker, whether it's a fact that he cares about corruption or he doesn't care about corruption, right? And so all that we can really say is that Trump says he's worried about fraud from mail-in ballots. Now that's a fact because it's over and over and over again. You can point to all the times he brings it up. That is a fact, but what he means to do or what his intentions are, that's up for grabs. And really, like, looking into somebody's mind for their intention is beyond the scope of this class, right? So I have nothing to give you to help you with that. But the example that I gave the student is like, look, my son always comes clean when he does something wrong. Mom, I hit Sarah. You know, he'll just come and you know, did you do your schoolwork? No. You know, he's always truthful. But my daughter, she lies, right? So when my daughter says I've done my schoolwork, I don't believe it because I have evidence to the contrary or whatever, right? And so so there is some evidence that can be brought to bear, but I can't really teach you how to do that well, okay? So beyond the esoteric discussion, let's start talking about the difference between a legality or a textual argument versus a normative argument. So if I tell you privacy is a right that the Supreme Court has declared that we have, that's sort of a fact. We know that, and we can look at Griswold. It is not a textual interpretation, because they say directly, we are declaring that there is a right to privacy, right? And so, but if you get into, well, where does the right to privacy begin and where does it end, and where, you know, where do we no longer have the expectation of privacy? You have to read the case law, and if you're going to be a good lawyer, you're going to do a better job interpreting that case law in front of a judge. You know, you say, Your Honor, as I read such and such, such and such, that was an illegal search. Here's my evidence. And the evidence is words, right? And that has nothing to do with should the police search in certain circumstances. So like in the 1980s, we had a public safety exception to police searches where they don't have probable cause. So if they don't have probable cause to ask somebody on the street, hey, you know, where is the gun or whatever, right? And they don't read you your rights before they ask you that. They might have done that because they're worried there's a gun sitting on the streets and somebody could get hurt or whatever. And so they put in public safety. So if police can defend their search without probable cause with public safety, it became an acceptable search. And so then you have to ask yourself, well, what do they mean by safety? Well, now they've heard dozens of cases that have filled in the meaning of what public safety means as the exception for that rule. And so you've got to tie together the inferences from the various texts and what the Supreme Court has said to come to a conclusion. Is this search legal or is it not legal? So when we get to the legal or textual interpretation part of the course, you're going to be arguing whether the Blaine Amendments are constitutional or not. And they either are or they're not, in a sense, right? And there may be some gray area there where this kind of Blaine Amendment is going to be acceptable and that kind is not. But pretty much it's really clear what the Blaine Amendments are. And you go look in the case law and you can find plenty of evidence for each side, which means now you've got something falsifiable. Now you've got something you can argue. Well, you can use the text to make an argument about your opinion about whether the Blaine Amendments are constitutional or not, which is not the same thing at all, or with any respect to should they be. Right? Should they be is a completely different kind of argument. You've got to figure out what your philosophical first principles are. What are you assuming about the world? You know, are there any causal or other kinds of legal questions that come up? And, you know, should we allow states to restrict government spending for religious issues is basically what it is. And the should opinion has absolutely nothing to do with what is the law regarding this issue. And when we get to the Blaine Amendments, you'll find that textual interpretation is one of the hardest things we do. That's why they pay lawyers all the big money that they earn. Most lawyers, I don't even know. Some lawyers, you know, won't make a lot of money, but it's a very, very difficult thing to do, is to make an argument based on text. And when people confuse, well, I like the Blaine Amendments, therefore they're legal, that's a big mistake. And that'll get you an F on a law school exam. They absolutely assume that you know that your opinion from your values or from your personal philosophical first principles has nothing to do with the law. You know, should this criminal go free is a different question from, was the evidence collected illegally, right? Now the two go together in a sense, because if it was collected illegally, then you can't have a trial and they'll throw it out. But that, you know, those are completely different issues, and you should not ever blend the two. They're really completely different from one another. Now, is it good that we follow most laws? Well, okay, let me look at all of you for this. How many of you, by just a show of hands, broke a law this week? I'm gonna out myself immediately here. Yeah, okay, yeah. Because if you sped or jaywalked, or I don't know what other kinds of laws you know you could break, but you've already, you know, so So we use that question in political surveys to gauge lying. If people say they didn't break a law, then we've kind of identified their answers as maybe being less valid because maybe they're lying to us or something. So we know that sometimes there's good reasons for speeding. You've got a bleeding child, you should probably speed, right? And so the law and what's good or virtuous have nothing to do with one another. We hope that they correlate, but do they? Let me get a show of hands. Who here believes everything that's legal is normatively defensible? That because it's the law, therefore it's good. Does anybody believe that? On the other hand, you can't have everybody just making up their own rules. And, I decide that red means go and green means stop. You just can't have that, And so, in fact, that's my most recent research project, is understanding the psychology of what makes people believe that the law is legitimate. So most people do, which I'm happy about, but I'm also bewildered by. That's why I'm researching it, because I'm like, I want to understand why these people believe that. Okay, so they're not the same thing, and they're based in completely different things. What is the law versus what should the law be? There's other kinds of textual interpretations. There's biblical interpretations. There's interpretation of, what does Trump really mean when he says XYZ? Or what does this newscaster really mean when they say XYZ? Anytime you have text and you have what could be a difference of opinion about what the meaning was or the intention behind the speaker, then you've got a textual argument, which all law is written in English or some language. And so you've got to make an argument often about what the law consists of. Okay, so let's talk about causality versus normative opinions. So you might be convinced that smoking causes cancer and therefore decide not to smoke, right? You could also be convinced that smoking causes cancer and smoke anyway, right? And so those two things are very separate things. If I say, in my esoteric discussion with a student this morning, if I say that teaching logic to law students causes students to be better lawyers or to argue better or causes them to be more successful or whatever, I might have that belief. But I also might just want to teach logic because I normatively believe that's the correct thing, regardless of what it causes, right? And so those two things are different. The other thing to be aware of is that when I'm speaking about causality, I'm speaking about probabilistic causality. Not everybody who smokes gets cancer. Some people get lung cancer even if they've never smoked a cigarette, right? And so there's cases that are outside the norm, and those don't necessarily disprove a probabilistic causal connection. Now, if I say Trump's worries about not winning the election are causing him to throw shade on mail-in voting, there's no evidence to prove that, right? I can't teach you how to provide evidence for that. And so when we're talking about probabilistic causality, you have to have multiple cases, right? You have to have a lot of people who smoke and a lot of people who don't smoke and a lot of people who get cancer and a lot of people who don't get cancer in order to make that inference, right? But like, what caused the Supreme Court to uphold Obamacare? Historians will have to, argue about that. That's not something social science can answer, What caused you to eat what you ate for breakfast? I mean, honestly, you have no idea. I have no idea what causes a single event is not is not what we mean by causality. And that leads me to say, in the law, there's a concept of causality that is not probabilistic causality. And that is, did the car cause the person's death? Or did they die for unrelated reasons that's not related to the car accident or what, you know? And so they, you know, there's a famous case where, I forget the situation, but you'll learn it in law school if you're planning to go to law school, where there's a guy who's next to a train and sees somebody running, and he runs to catch up with them, and the guy trips and the dynamite goes into the car and blows everybody up. There's some story like that. And it's like, well, what happened to cause the thing that happened next, which caused the thing to happen next, you know? And so that when you're talking about causality in that sense, those things are considered facts in the eyes of the law. So one thing you'll read next week with the summary of constitutional law is that trial courts, and this is true for state courts or federal court or bankruptcy court, or anytime there's a trial, the purpose of the trial is to find the fact. Did the person know that their brakes were faulty? That's a fact. Did the person know that they were driving down a neighborhood road where there could be kids? Did you know, should the person have known? What is the reasonable man, which is a concept in the law? What does a reasonable person assume when they make a decision with the way they make? Did the person intend to shoot their girlfriend through the door, or did they think credibly that it was somebody trying to break in, you know, the home? Those are questions of fact. And you know, guilt or innocence are questions of fact. And here's something that's kind of ugly that you'll find out about the legal system. Once a trial court or a jury or a judge has established facts, you cannot change those facts. So once you've established, the person knew that the brakes weren't, that the brakes were faulty, right? So they show the paperwork that they were in the shop, and the person says, well, the brakes are faulty. It doesn't matter whether it's actually true, but it's established as fact at trial. And then appeals courts can never change those facts, right? You can say, yes, the jury found the person guilty, but they're guilty of, you know, like in Boulder, I don't know if you know that it's illegal to say something bad about somebody based on their race or religion or veteran status and the whole list of things. And that law is, with a fact, unconstitutional. So if you're prosecuted, we could find you guilty of that, right? But the Supreme Court would let you go because, you know, it cannot be made a crime, right, according to the law. And so what appeals courts deal with are issues of law, issues of legal interpretation. So they can find that the police search was illegal and say, yes, we know that in this trial you found the person guilty, but the evidence was collected illegally. You can go retry if you want to without that evidence. Or if the prosecutor doesn't have any other evidence, then you have to let the person go. But that's an issue of law. Whether a crime is allowed to be a crime is an issue of law. It is not a crime to use a condom. Before 1965, it was a crime to use a condom, right? So when the Supreme Court said it is no longer a crime to use birth control, then it's no longer a crime. Then you could be found guilty for it and still not be actually, you know, a criminal. And so it's really important that you understand the difference between those two things, because, you know, once you go to law school and you become a lawyer, you know that you have to accept the facts as given by the trial. And then in appeals court, you can argue, well, the search was illegal, or I was a lawyer and I did a bad job defending the person, or, you know, whatever that, you know, because there's a law saying you have to have a good lawyer, you know. And so sometimes I hear when I read juror transcripts, they'll say, well, the person obviously wasn't guilty, but I voted guilty anyway, just because I wanted to go on with my day. And I know he'll get off on appeal anyway. And it's like, oh no, you just decided fact. And that fact cannot be changed unless a court decides that no reasonable person could have ever come to that conclusion. So like in the very rare instances that people are let off for DNA evidence, they will say that if we had that evidence at trial, no reasonable person would find the person guilty, so we're letting them go. Okay, so fact versus normative. So normative values are questions of how we should live. You know, if your highest value is to be the best Christian or the best environmentalist or the best student or the best daughter or son, or, you know, the best mother, or, you know, then you have to define what good means to you, right? And what good means to one person, we know, is not the same thing as what's good meant for other people. Now, some normative values are more intersubjective. In other words, they're more verifiably true. One is nobody wants to die or be tortured to death. And let me just make sure I have you all agreeing with that. Nobody wants to die and be tortured to death. Maybe people want to die, but you don't want to be tortured to death like that. You know, that's, you know, one thing. And so, for instance, Hobbes looks at that. Thomas Hobbes, who's known for being the most pessimistic philosopher. Well, I'm not sure I agree with that. He gets a bad rap. But, you know, he starts with that. He says, that's our 1 + 1 = 2 in political science. We know that nobody wants to die or be tortured to death. So let's prevent that and engage in the causal questions that prevent what we all know to be bad, right? A show of hands that people should vote illegally. Does anybody agree with that? No, right? Like there's some things, right? You know, how many people believe you should vote? You know, I cry every time I vote because I love voting, you know, but like we should vote, right? You know, so there's things that are more intersubjective. You know, how many people believe we should have free speech? Right? Virtually everybody agrees with that. How many people believe neo-Nazis should be able to speak? I'm in that camp. But there's, you know, that's less intersubjective. Intersubjectivity is, you know, if we just look on it on the merits, this is true. For instance, I heard a rumor, I don't know if it's true, that everybody in the philosophy department is vegetarian. Now, you might look at that and say, like, they've all looked at the ethical questions and, you know, they buy into the suffering is bad kind of concept. And they say, you know what, this is a lot of suffering, we're not getting a lot of benefit. And they've come to a conclusion that they believe is intersubjective. Now, does everybody believe we shouldn't eat meat? Obviously not, right? And so those are more controversial questions, and by controversial I mean just not intersubjective, that you can't depend on everybody believes that, you know. Okay, so getting to legality versus causality. So here's one thing that I got from students' papers forever was here's the Griswold case. They decided that there's a right to privacy, and what made them agree to that is the birth control pill was invented. Now that irritates me for a number of reasons. One, we have no idea what was in their mind. Even if they tell us what was on their mind, we have no idea what's on their mind. And like, you know, what you learn in law school is that these judges believe in strict constructionism or original intent, and here's their rationale, and they believe in precedent. You know, you kind of learn that. In political science, we kind of learn that most of what they write is bullshit. Sorry. It's the law. It doesn't change anything, right? But most of what they write is a post hoc rationalization for doing what they wanted to do anyway. You know, the correlation between people's ideological justices on the Supreme Court, their ideological vision, whether they're conservative or liberal, accounts for 80% of the variation in their votes. Now that's an awful lot, right? And so it's not as if they're all like umpires going strike or, you know, ball or whatever. You know, it's more complicated than that. And people are, of course, and I don't, so when I say it's bullshit, I don't mean to necessarily criticize them. They signed up for this thing, that they're going to write this opinion. They're going to give you 100 pages of rationalization for why, you know, like in Hamdi, which is a case I just read recently, is a case that said, here's a person who was born in the United States, spent a month here, was born to Saudi citizens, grew up in Saudi Arabia, never returned to the United States, and then joined the Taliban and shooting on American soldiers. Well, the Supreme Court said he's a citizen. He was born in the United States, right? Like that, you know, that's what the Supreme Court said. Now, should the person be considered a citizen? That's a whole different issue, right? But it is their opinion. Now, why do they decide that opinion the way they did? What makes them decide that? Is it because it was written down, born in the United States? Or like one of my fellow colleagues says, you're not a citizen if you're not born in the United States. Now, I think this particular professor is confused about their normative opinion versus the legal opinion, because the legal opinion says they're citizens. Like, there is no question about that. But he's saying they're wrong. Now, then you got to figure out.
Does he not recognize naturalized citizens at all?
He does recognize naturalization. He just doesn't believe everybody born on the soil is a citizen.
A bold take.
What's that?
That is a very bold take on that. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a bold, and if you don't mind me commentating, some commentary.
Not at all.
Kind of a dumb take, you know. I mean, it's dumb legally because it's clearly not the law. And it's also repugnant to me morally, but that's also my own particular commentary. But can you still see my screen? Okay.
Yeah.
You know, I'm going to get used to this by the end of class, I promise. You know, and so, you know, it's, and then you got to think, well, why is he making that claim? Because he was making the claim that Kamala Harris is not a citizen, regardless of the fact that she was born here and grew up here and was, you know. And so then you're like, well, what is that intention, right? And so then you get into what's going on with that person. So like, you know, and I can't speak to that, but I do believe that the person is mixing up their normative views with their views about the law, you know. Okay, so anyway, legality versus causality. So like, what causes the Supreme Court justices to say what they say, to bring up this precedent versus not bring up that precedent? But, you know, what causes justices to follow precedent versus not? Those are all completely separate questions from what is the law. What did they say? And what they say is the law, right? Regardless of, you know, like if this professor was on the US Supreme Court, he would say Hamdi's not a citizen, and neither is Kamala Harris. And so she shouldn't be able to be vice president, or, you know, but the person's not on the Supreme Court. And so, you know, like their legal opinion is not the law. But, getting into the discussion about like what causes a justice to say what they say is my field of work, right? Those are political scientists who are trying to figure out, of all the judges who decide what they decide and say what they say, what is the relationship between those two things? And those are completely separate questions from the truth of what they say or the moral defense ability of what they say, right? Those are separate things. I'm hoping what you're getting from this discussion is that there's gray area sometimes, like the smoking causes cancer is closer to a verifiable fact than a causal inference. It's still technically a causal inference, but there's gray area. So legality versus fact. So here's one thing.
Professor?
Yes.
I just want to say we're technically over our time limit. I don't have another class to go to, but I know my friends do.
Oh my God. Okay. So I'm glad you told me that. You can stay or hop out or, whatever, but I'll give the other students a chance to kind of participate in this discussion. But so I'll just quick finish with this slide. And on Friday, we're going to talk about the other logical fallacies and examples of the other logical fallacies. But, what is written in a case is a fact. Like, does it say in the Bible, thou shalt not kill? Yes, it does say that, right? Like you can say, well, not my version, or what, it's like, okay, but then that's not the Bible we're all talking about, but what does kill mean? Is something that theologians discuss as being quite controversial. So it probably doesn't mean killing a fly. It probably includes murder, right? But then murder in self-defense is not necessarily murder. So it gets to the questions of the meaning of what the Bible commands or what the law commands. And so the fact is what is written down. Is it a fact that Trump said what he said or that Biden said what he said? Yes. But what is the meaning behind those words is a separate question. So that's the difference between legality and a fact. Legality and textual interpretation is an argument that is by definition not true. Like what constitutes murder and what kinds of things are murder versus what kinds of things are not murder. None of that, I can't tell you the fact of that, right? But I can just say that it says in the Bible, thou shalt not kill. That's a fact. Causality versus legality, we've already done that. That was just a duplicate. So I don't know if anybody has any questions or any other things that you'd like to discuss as we're over our time. Okay, well, I'll end that for now, but I'll stick around in case you have any particular questions, because I figure people have a few minutes maybe after class or before class to ask questions. So I don't know if anybody has any examples or any questions about something's not clear.
My biggest question, I think, is in the causality argument. How would you define causality? Just like if there's one sentence to define it, just so to differentiate.
I would call it what I mean by causality, probabilistic causality. So people who are more optimistic tend to be more likely to vote. So when you have a question of causality, often what you have are two concepts stuck together by saying that the more or less of X, Y, or Z you have, the more or less of A, B, and C you have. So the more you smoke, the higher probability of getting cancer. The more optimistic people are, the more likely they are to vote. The more optimistic people are, the more likely they are to volunteer. The more optimistic people are, the more likely they are to trust strangers, right? And these are all, so in my recent work on the psychology of the rule of law, one thing I showed that I'm hoping is people will consider to be non-obvious, right? Like it's not the first thing everybody would think of, is that the more people are sensitive to the violation of social norms. Like, so think for a minute about that concept and think like, if I was rude to you, and I'm a professor, and it feels kind of weird for a professor to be rude to you, do you kind of know where you are on your outrage, your level of outrage with that? I personally am very outraged when people are rude to me. I feel very upset by it. I don't know if you have thoughts about that. But what I found, and I had this hypothesis way before I ever collected the data, that people who are more sensitive to the violation of social norms support the legitimacy of the law more than other people. It's kind of an interesting, it's not the first thing you think of, right? Like you think, well, people who were brought up by parents who tell you to obey are more likely to support the law. That's all obvious, right? But when you're trying to be an academic, you're trying to point out things that no one's ever thought of before. And so I explained my theory for why I believe that to be true. And then I tested the hypothesis. And then it showed that there was a relationship, even controlling for all kind of stuff, most of which is also obvious. Another thing you wouldn't think of probably is the more control people believe they have of their own life, the more they support the law, and it's a really strong relationship. So I have a causal theory, and then I test that theory with the hypothesis, and then at the end of the paper, I'm making a causal inference. I believe that that quality caused people to support the law more, right? But it's not true, right? I could be capturing something else. It could just be randomly, the survey I did randomly showed people to have those two things. And so I'm making a causal inference that I believe those things are causally connected. So that, let's say people who experience negative things about the police support the police less. That turns out to not be true over and over and over again, as much as we tested. It's also not true that white people support the police more than Black people. It's like, there's a lot of misconceptions about that. But you can show, well, I believe there's going to be a causal relationship. And then if you're unable to support that, you still can't say, well, there's no causal relationship, but you make a more credible argument for, I've tested it, here's the data. I didn't, choose and pick, where like, I don't like those people because they're not consistent with my evidence. It's not something that's valid scientifically. And so causal questions are scientific questions of causal probabilities across multiple units, where you're connecting two concepts that vary from high to low, that the more or less you have of one thing, the more you have of something else. I don't know if that's helpful.
Definitely helps.
Yeah. I spend a lot of time or a lot of my career helping students understand the questions of causality, and fortunately people are taking it much more seriously now, is that Stanford bullshit course. Their entire purpose is to really question whether scientific inferences are valid or not. So, and I feel like that's a useful thing to do. Now on the quiz, you're going to get a list of statements. You have to say, I believe this statement is normative statement. So if I tell you I believe the Supreme Court is too liberal, what do you know about me?
Based only off that sentence?
Yeah. I mean, do you know anything about me? If I say the Supreme Court is way too liberal these days, what do you know about me?
You're very conservative.
I'm conservative, right? Like it's conservatives who are telling you what their values are when they say that. If I say the Supreme Court should uphold birthright citizenship, then I'm telling you something that I value birthright citizenship, right? Or if I say we should just obey the law no matter what, then you know I'm kind of authoritarian who doesn't understand complicated ethical questions of speeding when you take your bleeding child to the ER or whatever, right? You know, it shows a lack of thoughtfulness or whatever, but I'm revealing that in my values to you, right? And so anytime somebody's saying something should be the way it is, or we should have national standards for religious freedom, or we should vote for Trump or whatever. If I tell you we should vote for Trump, you probably at least think you would know a lot about me, right? If I said that. And so it's like, I'm revealing to you my values when I say that, right? Just like, you know, you shouldn't vote or whatever. Then I'm revealing to you, I don't care about democracy. So it's like, what am I doing here? You know? But that's different from the Supreme Court has said we no longer have birthright citizenship. Like if they've said that, then that's the fact about the law, right? And I could still say I think it's terrible, you know, and you know that's a separate issue. But when you have opinions, you should probably never be too sure of them, you know, unless it's like, don't kill and torture each other to death. You know, there's some things that are clearer than others, but like, should we have the death penalty? Should we allow hate speech on campus? Those are more difficult ethical questions that I have an opinion on those issues, but I don't believe them, you know, in a sense. And the more educated you become, I think the less you believe your opinions. You know, the more you're willing to take issue with, well, what are my assumptions there? And what are my philosophical first principles if I believe we should eat meat? Maybe I should question that, you know, is how I'm at least training you to have that capability with the logical questions in the class. Does anybody else have any questions about, is everything on the syllabus clear and the way Canvas works? I'm kind of unfamiliar with how familiar you all are with Canvas. I figure most of the professors are using it a lot. And so I don't know if anything I'm doing is annoying because I've been like, somebody taught my class because I was on medical leave last year. So all of his assignments were up and, you know, it was a whole mess. So I have been deleting them. I don't know if you guys get a notification every time I do something, but it must be irritating if you do because I've been cleaning out a bunch of stuff in this particular course. But I'm hoping that it's not too difficult to maneuver.
So just to be clear, we do have an assignment due this week for the group work.
Well, every week, if you want the points for the group work, then you should summarize what your group is doing. And you shouldn't summarize it if you're not doing it. But if you're doing it, you should, you know, just go in there and write a sentence. This is what our group did this week, you know, and so you should meet with your group outside of class at some point, or at least come up with a time that you could work together on something. And then if you write a sentence, then you get the points for the group work. And just a weird thing about the syllabus, because 15 doesn't divide into 4 evenly, you get more credit for group work in this first 3 weeks. You get 170 points per week, whereas the rest of the semester, the group work is 125 per week, just because of division.
You stated on Monday that we could count group work that wasn't like actually part of the group you assigned us to, right? Like we could study with like 1 person or 2 people and that would count?
Yep.
Awesome.
Yep. So find somebody who's put a thoughtful discussion and write that person and say, I really would like to, you know, form a study group with you. Some people are better one-on-one. I'm not. I'm more comfortable in front of 1,000 people than I am one-on-one. I'm like, you know, I'm an entertainer. I enjoy that. But a lot of people are real, you know, they love one-on-one. And so, you know, later in the semester, what will happen is there'll be stronger students and weaker students. And weaker students will say, is there anybody who could tutor me? And signing up to tutor a student counts as group work. So, you know, so I will be encouraging you all to do that, if, you know, or to be tutored. Or sometimes it's just the two smartest students in the class want to get together and, you know, challenge one another in that context, which is that's totally a legitimate, you know, form of group work. But this should be fun. It should be engaging. It should be, you know, I'm trying to make, you know, within the constraints that I operate from, which is we have to have grades, and it's, you know, and I hate the punitive aspect of the grades. And, you know, I always try to be reasonable, but, you know, we should be thinking like, what is this thing that we're doing here in college? And what should we be doing? And how should we be learning? And, you know, what is the difference between legal interpretation and normative? And can you come up with examples of things that are between the lines of each one of those? And I think that's what the suggested project is for this part of the semester, is to, I might have a couple of them, but one is to write an essay showing that you've seen people confusing legal arguments with normative arguments, or normative arguments with causal arguments, you know. And in the more esoteric discussion I had with the student this morning, you know, they noticed that in the how to think like a lawyer essay, the person's like, you know, it's too bad, you know, we just don't teach logic anymore in law school. And I'm like, does he really know that? Does he interviewed all the law professors and he knows? And what does he mean by logic? And it's like, he probably hasn't interrogated that. And he probably just means we should teach logic. But actually what he means is he's making a causal argument. If we teach logic, students will be better at X, Y, and Z, right? And so that's actually a more causal question. And so you should interrogate the purpose of the discussions you're having, you know. Oh, okay, adios.